The negligence question will ask you to analyze the breach aspects of negligence and the cause and fact aspects. Duty you won't be analyzing, and proximate cause you won't be analyzing. So you need to know how to handle questions in terms of breach and cause and fact. We haven't done cause and fact in class, but you can bring in an outline, read the outline, whatever you want. Use whatever materials you want to try to answer the question. But you're going to be practicing under exam conditions of how you would answer it. So with breach, moving to breach. We don't have an intentional tort, it was some kind of accidental harm. The plaintiff sues the defendant. The issue is whether or not there's a negligence liability. There has to be a duty of reasonable care to the plaintiff, but we're going to assume that for purposes of this practice exam. So then the issue becomes, did they breach their duty of reasonable care? And then the second issue you'll be dealing with is, did the breach cause any harm, in fact, that the plaintiff can collect for? So breach and cause and fact. So when you start with breach, you got A suing B or B suing D, one party suing another. The issue becomes, and the issue never changes, is did the defendant use reasonable care under the circumstances? Plaintiff has the burden of proof to show that the defendant failed to use reasonable care under the circumstances. If plaintiff can show that, then the court will conclude that the defendant has breached his or her duty of reasonable care. That's what breach is all about. It's a failure to use reasonable care under the circumstances. There are 6 different approaches that the courts have created at common law of approaching this. In the ordinary case, you're just arguing. The person was, in driving that fast, wasn't using reasonable care. The person, the way they were swinging that axe in the crowd, wasn't using reasonable care. You can simply argue it. What the courts find useful and what students find useful, and to be persuasive about that, is to try using a learned hand test. Learned hand test is not, or approach, it's not even a test, is not a rule. It's not something the courts demand. It's a way of analyzing so that you can intelligently come to a conclusion that it's arguable that this person did fail to use reasonable care. And learned hand starts by saying that if the risk outweighed the benefits, then you're not acting reasonable in taking that risk. And then he breaks down risk into 2 components and comes up with a fake mathematical formula. He says risk is composed of probability of harm and gravity of harm. And if that risk outweighs any benefit from the conduct, then they're acting negligently. They're failing to use reasonable care. So you've got to combine the probability of harm with the gravity of harm, and then measure that against what's the burden if we're asking the defendant to act more carefully. Does the risk outweigh any burden we're imposing if we say this is negligent conduct? Another way of looking at it is the way the defendant is acting now so socially useful? Does it have enough social utility that we ought to let him keep acting that way? That the social value of the conduct outweighs any risks. There's risks to all conduct. But lots of conduct with risk is still reasonable. Why? Because it's valuable conduct. So the issue becomes, do the probability and gravity outweigh the burden of acting more carefully? So you split it into those things. First, analyze, look at the conduct, and ask yourself, what's the probability of any harm coming from this conduct? It's not that difficult to assess that. If someone's driving 90 during rush hour with their eyes shut down Connecticut Avenue, there's a high probability of harm. If someone is merely blinking while doing 20 miles an hour, it's not rush hour, there's a low probability of harm. So first characterize what's the probability of any harm. Where students often go wrong there is they look at what actually happened and they ask what's the probability of that. That's not what learned hand or the courts are asking for. You can be negligent without any harm occurring. So what they're saying is, what's the probability, looking at your conduct before the harm occurs? What's the probability of any harm from that kind of conduct? So the magic phrase is probability of any harm. Next you look at, what's the gravity of the harm you're risking? Well, there's some probability of harm, but how serious is the harm? What's the gravity of the likely harm? Not what actually happened, but what's the gravity of the harm you're risking? You're flying nuclear bombs over the country. You're dead drunk. You got a high probability of making a mistake. You got a high probability of harm there if you're dead drunk and it's complicated machinery. But that's not the only component. What's the gravity you're risking? Death for everyone. The most serious gravity in the world. So the risk goes way up depending on the gravity of the harm. It's not what actually occurred. Because you were drunk, you crashed, but nothing exploded. You were still negligent. Why? You had a high probability of harm and you were risking extremely grave harm. You weren't acting reasonably. So it's the gravity of any harm should harm occur. You're speculating with both of these. You're looking at conduct, you're speculating, is it reasonable? Well, what's the probability of any harm occurring from this conduct? What's the gravity of any harm should harm occur from this conduct? What's the likely gravity? Then you balance it from the other side, saying, now, does that outweigh the burden that we're imposing on the defendant? We are imposing a burden on the defendant if we say this is negligent. Why? Because everybody's going to have to act more carefully in these circumstances. What's the burden of acting more carefully? If the burden is very, very large and the risk is very low, the probability and gravity aren't that serious, the court's going to say it's reasonable conduct. It's got some risks, but they're reasonable risks. It's too burdensome to ask people to act more carefully under these circumstances. We saw the very first case, leaving a golf club in the backyard. Is there some risk to leaving a golf club in a backyard where there's kids? Yes. What's the probability of harm? Not that high, but there's some probability because kids are careless. And they like to pick up things. They like to act like adults. So they'll be swinging that club. Are they risking anything grave in that kind of conduct? Yeah, they could whack someone in the head with it. It's not going to be as grave as using a gun or an axe, but there's some gravity they're risking of serious harm. Well, then what's the burden? Before we conclude whether this conduct is reasonable or unreasonable, what's the burden if they have to act more carefully? And at that point, the court said, it didn't say it using a learned hand test, but it said it consistent with the learned hand test, that the burden of acting more carefully is too large here. That if we say this guy's conduct is negligent, it means everybody's got to keep their yards very clean. They can't leave bats out in the yard. They're equally dangerous. They can't leave sticks, long sticks out in the yard. They can't leave all sorts of objects in the yard that are equally dangerous. That means all of us are going to have to spend a lot of time watching and cleaning up our yards. The court says the risk isn't worth it, that kind of burden. And therefore, those risks are reasonable, not unreasonable. Therefore, there's no breach. There's no failure to use reasonable care in leaving it out. Now, would they say it's different if they left out a loaded machine gun? Of course they would. Why? The probability of harm goes up, and the gravity goes up much sooner, and there's no value to that. If we say that leaving a live machine gun out there is negligence, we're not telling everyone they got to clean up their entire yards of any long sticks. So what's reasonable varies depending on the circumstances, and it varies depending upon probability gravity measured against the burden of acting more carefully. Another way of analyzing what's the burden of acting more carefully, say, how valuable is it if we leave the conduct as it is? Is there some social utility in not picking up golf clubs every time you see a golf club in a backyard? Well, there's some social value to that. You don't waste a lot of time constantly keeping your yard clean of any long objects. So social utility is the flip side of burden. You don't have to even bring it up. If you want to keep it simple, measure the probability and gravity against the burden of acting more carefully. In analyzing this, we're not only asking what's the burden on this defendant, though that's part of it, what's the burden on society if we say this defendant is negligent? An example of that was using safety glass in shower installments in the state of New York. New York had to decide whether or not using safety glass in shower enclosures was negligent not to have safety glass. The defendants were arguing it's not that big a risk. We don't have all that many injuries coming from using regular glass. Most of these showers in the older buildings have regular glass. They don't have safety glass. There aren't a lot of accidents. And it's too burdensome to tell us we all now have to install safety glass in every shower enclosure. It's going to cost a lot of money. The money's going to be passed on to tenants. Tenants don't have a lot of money. The risk is not worth all that expense and burden. The court disagreed. The court said it's not that costly anymore and it is very dangerous, and the time has come to where the risk does outweigh the burden. You can share that cost around. It's not that burdensome. It is there. You are risking grave injury as in the actual case, and they decided that from now on that's negligent conduct. But to properly assess that, it's not only the burden on this